We've known the name of the founder of the Treasure Hoarders since the very start of the game, but until Krai rolled around, the name was the only thing we knew. And it turns out that Reed Miller was a lot more than just a petty thief. Now, I kind of expected some kind of Robin Hood-style origin story, but I don't think anything quite prepared me for the sheer amount of twists and turns his, or rather, their story would take. So today, I'd like to share that story with you. And to do that, I'll be laying out the history of Reed Miller using all the information I could find in artifacts, weapons, books, materials, and the world quests that are scattered throughout Krai. And I'll be putting that in chronological order. Now, it's very important to note that this video will not contain any theories per se, but we may have some reasonable assumptions here and there to fill in the gaps wherever the information we have is insufficient. We're trying to keep the lore as straightforward as possible. But before we begin our treasure hunting adventure, allow me the honor of introducing the sponsor of today's video, the Red Magic 11 Air gaming phone. I've had the privilege to test out a lot of Red Magic's phones, but this one's the coolest looking one of the bunch. I just really like the orange and copper details. It's almost a shame to put a case on it. But this phone doesn't just look cool, it stays cool as well, even with its super slim form factor thanks to its shockingly quiet fans and special graphene heat sinks. And this unique cooling system doesn't just prevent sweaty gamer palms, it also increases the overall lifespan of your phone. The longer your phone lasts, the more money you save in the long run. And you'll get to enjoy the Red Magic 11 Air's sharp, vivid OLED display, dual high-performance speakers, and unrivaled gaming performance for that much longer. And I do mean unrivaled, because this phone is powerful. It can handle bloom, motion blur, and 60 FPS with no problem. And that performance doesn't come at the cost of your battery life, because the Red Magic 11 Air 7000 mAh high-capacity battery literally lets you game for an entire day without needing to charge your device once. So if you're playing Genshin on its maximum settings, you can play for nearly 8 hours straight. That's the minimum battery life. I personally don't like things like bloom and motion blur, so when I turn those off, I can get up to 10, oftentimes 14 without having to worry about my battery. And you get all of this at an excellent price point. So if you're in the market for a new phone or a handheld gaming system, then consider picking up the all-new Red Magic 11 Air using the link in my description box. I know you'll be just as happy with your purchase as I am with mine. A big thanks to the Red Magic 11 Air gaming phone for sponsoring this video, and now it is finally time to talk about the guy who has the same initials as the Red Magic Air. You know the one, Mr. Reed Miller, specifically Avrelian. And his story begins over 6,000 years ago. Because it was around 6,000 years ago that Tevat's original ruler, the Dragon King Nibelung, had left on a spacefaring expedition after meeting a lone space traveler named Voyager. He left Tevat in the care of his 3 moon goddesses, but when the first descender invaded and began populating the planet with humans, they did not interfere. Apparently, an alien invasion and colonization does not count as a threat towards the planet. It was around this time that Voyager returned to Tevat to check in on their friend Nibelung, only to find someone else sitting in his throne. Curious about what had happened, they entered Tevat and soon met the first angel, Koitar. Together, Koitar and Voyager conspired against the first descender and rallied an army within the northern city of Hyperborea. But despite the dragon sovereigns joining in on the battle and the return of Nibelung himself, the first descender emerged victorious from this war of funerary flame. But the casualties were no joke. Hyperborea was destroyed by a celestial nail while the iridescent and eternal moons were shattered, and the frost moon cast out of Tevat's orbit. But just before her moon was flung too far, the frost moon allegedly blessed her followers one last time and told them to travel south to settle on the island of Krai. These Hyperborean refugees would eventually become known as the Frost Moon Scions. Now, I say she allegedly blessed and instructed the Frost Moon Scions because I'm not entirely sure how this would have happened, because Nibelung technically had sealed all 3 moon goddesses in a prison outside the boundaries of space-time before the moons were shattered and tossed. So I don't know that there was actually a point in time when the Frost Moon would have thought to instruct her followers to move south before she was sent to prison and effectively cut off from them. I could be wrong because it's not really stated anywhere, and this whole account is just mentioned in a legend. But my assumption is that it's more likely that the instruction came from somewhere or someone else. Probably Columbina, who at this point in time would have met the 3 imprisoned goddesses, taken their trilunar authority, hid her soul in the frost moon, which had yet to be flung out of orbit, and then converted her body into lunar Kuvaki energy, which then settled settled upon Nod Krai. Perhaps at that moment when she was splitting her body into different bits, she also sent a message to the Frostmoon Scions. Again, this is an assumption, but I'm making it not just because it lines up with the order of events, but also because the Frostmoon Scions' so-called blessing seems to be tied to their ability to use Kuvaki, which is Columbina's body. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter who was responsible for blessing and sending the Frostmoon Scions south. It only matters that this happened. Anyway, the resettled Frostmoon Scions brought with them several relics made by Voyager, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as a prophecy. This prophecy claimed that a Frostmoon Scion would one day give birth to an heir with sacred blood, and that heir would use one of Voyager's inventions, the Sampo Mill, to recreate an Elysium for the Frostmoon Scions, initiating a new era of prosperity much like the one they had lost in Hyperborea. Now, the story of the Sampo comes from Finnish mythology. It's a device most commonly described as a magic hand mill that can create infinite grain and gold, so it's literally a device that provides the necessary ingredients for a prosperous paradise. Now, I've talked about the mythical Sampo at length in this video, which goes over some of Nod Krai's mythological references, and also this video, which contains a theory about Reed Miller and why I think the Sampo is a type of seed. So I'm not going to rehash all the details here. However, much like its mythological counterpart, Genshin's version of the Sampo is also a device of creation. In fact, its name is an acronym that stands for Subatomic Assembling Mass Energy Patterning Orb. That basically makes this a sort of transmutation device which can take matter and convert it into energy and then back to matter again. Alternatively, you can take existing matter and convert it just into raw energy and then unleash that energy in a giant laser beam. I'm totally not foreshadowing anything at all. Now, this incredibly powerful piece of alien technology requires someone who can either use Kuvaki or abyssal energy sufficiently. I have thoughts about why this device can take both types of energy, but that's a theory for another time. The only important thing to note here is that allegedly, a Frostmoon Scion's ability to control Kuvaki energy is directly tied to the purity of their sacred silver blood. Now, the Frostmoon Scions also believe that the sacred heir born to them would possess the purest of blood, hence my previous comment. And for that reason, the priesthood secretly implemented rigorous rules around marriage and labeled those rules as rituals so that the faithful had to adhere to them. This controlled marriage project, intent on producing the sacred heir with the most pure bloodline, was appropriately named the Sacred Heir Project. Now, it took quite some time before the Frostmoon Scions priesthood eventually realized that their efforts were rather pointless because the control module for the Sampo had been lost or damaged beyond repair during their flight from Hyperborea. And it wasn't like they had anybody who could repair the device or make a new control module. So while it was still possible to use Kuvaki or abyssal power to brute force the Sampo's functions without the control module, doing so was considered too risky. You remember how I said that it was a matter transmutation device and that it could convert matter into energy and then back to matter again? If you were to try to force this process without a control module, chances are pretty good you'd take the matter, turn it into energy, and then it would like explode or something. So, you know, a little dangerous. And without a safe means to control the Sampo, the Sacred Heir Project was essentially abandoned, and the relic was relegated to the role of a ritual item, only to be handled by high-ranking priests. After about 13 generations, the Frostmoon Scion's power over Kuvaki began to wane, and even the Archpriestess of the time had lost the ability to control Kuvaki entirely. And since they could no longer rely on the moon's blessing for their way of life, the Archpriestess decided to choose an outsider, her adopted daughter Lovia, to become her successor and give the Frostmoon Scions a new direction. The Archpriestess seemed to be of the belief that her decision would promote unity among her people, since Lovia was born to outsiders and had never possessed Frostmoon Scion blood or blessings, although Lovia herself was unaware of this. And this could help bridge the gap between the Frostmoon Scions, who were kind of isolationist, and the other people within Nod Krai at the time. At first, Lovia did exactly as her mother hoped she would. She led her people towards a future without the moon's blessing in it. But change prompts resistance. And for Lovia, the resistance made her a target of assassination. And while she survived the attempts, her sister did not. She died protecting Lovia from the assassins. The murder of her sister changed Lovia fundamentally. On the one hand, it seems like she believed that the direction she was leading people in was the wrong direction. But on the other hand, she resented the Frost Moon for not allowing them to have their Elysium. So Lovia decided to take fate into her own hands. She would build that new paradise the Frost Moon had denied them, a new Elysium. a place where the guilty would pay for their crimes with their own blood, and where the faithful would no longer have to suffer at the whims of a god long dead. To do this, Lovia revived the Sacred Heir project and determined that her sister's orphaned daughter, a scion with the purest blood, would give birth to the Sacred Heir. But Lovia's niece wanted to marry an outsider instead of her arranged Frostmoon scion partner, which was not allowed under the rules of Lovia's Sacred Heir project. So, Lovia's niece eloped with her favored partner, an officer from Snezhnaya, and unbeknownst to Lovia, she bore him a son by the name of Avrelian. Lovia was furious with her niece's elopement. Her niece had to give birth to the Sacred Heir, and if that meant kidnapping her and bringing her back and forcing her into an arranged marriage, then Lovia was willing to do that. So she requested the assistance of the Cryo-Archon's favorite royal mage, Rotwang, to help her find and capture her niece. Now, Rotwang is an interesting fella. He was originally from Teyvat, but he fled to Khaenri'ah around 1,000 years prior to these events, where he became a researcher at the Universitas Magistrorum under the name Rotwangi. There he became obsessed with what he called the pitch-black Elysium that he saw within the depths of the abyss. So he began pursuing forbidden knowledge in order to recreate this Elysium for himself. However, this was illegal in Khaenri'ah, so he was tried in Khaenri'ahn court, then exiled to Teyvat, where he was expected to succumb to the curse of the wilderness and become a hilichurl. But shockingly, Rotwang remained unaffected by this curse, perhaps due to all the abyssal exposure he'd endured because of his research. So Rotwang would spend years wandering Teyvat, eventually arriving in Krai, where he discovered something that would help him open the door to the abyss, but he needed both time and resources to make it happen. So he decided to go to Snezhnaya and earn the favor of the Belyit Tsar, who could provide him with both resources and time. Now, you'd think that an Archon would be against the idea of opening the gates to the abyss, but the Tsar had a unique relationship with both the abyss and Celestia. For reasons we are not currently privy to, the Belyit Tsar had long wanted to rebel against the heavenly principles, and to that end, according to the hymns of the far north, he'd tried to open the gates to the abyss once before with the help of the alleged third descender, Saralainen. Now, that endeavor got Saralainen split into 7 pieces, which then became the Gnosis, allegedly, but the Tsar never gave up looking for a way to open the gates again. So when Rotwang came along, declaring his intention to open the gates to the abyss himself with the skills and knowledge to pull it off, the Tsar was easily swayed. Now, Rotwang's plan was actually pretty simple, all things considered. He would first construct a tower, that's what the Pillar of Embla was supposed to be, and then he would place the Frostmoon Scion's Sampo mill at its core. The Sampo would then siphon the power and energy within all lifeforms within a large radius of the tower, and then use that power to shoot a giant hole in the false sky, revealing the abyss on the other side. So basically, the Sampo is taking all of the matter from the surrounding area and converting it into raw energy, which he's going to fire at the sky as a giant laser beam. See, I told you it was foreshadowing. That aside, Lovia needed to find her niece, and Rotwang probably agreed to help find her niece because doing so would earn him Lovia's trust and favor, 2 things he would need if he wanted to get access to the Sampo that was in her possession. So Rotwang used his power within the royal court to find Lovia's missing niece and her new husband, but it seems as though Lovia's niece caught wind of this plot and managed to hide her newborn son before Rotwang's men arrived. Her husband died during this encounter, and while she was captured alive and taken to the Frostmoon Enclave, she ended her own life soon after. Lovia was extremely distraught over the death of her niece and the loss of what she believed to be the unborn Sacred Heir. But she still needed a Sacred Heir and someone to give birth to them. So Lovia turned to a so-called lesser bloodline and decided to raise the infant twins, Alia and Alia, to take her niece's place. Their blood wasn't nearly as blessed or pure, I guess, as her niece's blood was, but Lovia had a plan to remedy that. She spent years training the twins in the art of assassination, and she would periodically have them kill off certain Frostmoon scions, and then she'd make them drink their blood. The idea is that by drinking the blood of other Frostmoon scions, the blessings and power within it would get absorbed into them and perhaps refine their own weak powers in their own blood. I don't know what kind of twisted vampire logic this is, but okay. And throughout all this, Lovia continued to correspond with Rotwang, believing he could help her unlock the mysteries of the Sampo in preparation for the birth of the heir, because remember, they would still need some sort of control module or regulation method to operate the Sampo correctly. But while Lovia was unaware that her niece had given birth and left behind her infant son, there is evidence to suggest that Rotwang not only knew about Avrelian, but also that he hid him from Lovia in Snezhnaya, where he was adopted by a Snezhnayan military officer. After after adoption, Avrelian seems to have lived a somewhat normal life, even attending a military academy where he met his best friend Solovey. And had Rotwang let him be, he may have become an officer himself. But it seems like Rotwang was also pulling some strings behind the scenes, which somehow convinced Avrelian to fake his own death and leave Snezhnaya in search of adventure and treasure under the alias Reed Miller. Side note, Avrelian's real name and alias is super funny to me for many reasons, but the two big ones are the fact that Avrelian means golden and Reed Miller means milling grain, because grasses are reeds and you mill them. And the mythological Sampo mill that the Genshin version is based on was said to make both gold and grain, and if he's supposed to be the sacred heir, then Hoyoverse thinks they're hilarious. And they got a giggle out of me, so I guess it's true. Anyway, Avrelian's travels clued him into the injustices of the world, and he wanted to do something about it. So he began gathering the hopeless and the destitute under the banner of his Black Raven. These people would form the very first Treasure Hoarders. But the treasure they were hoarding came from the wealthy and the elites. The initial form of this organization was a lot more Robin Hood than its modern counterpart. They were kind of revolutionaries who believed in Avrelian's vision of a future where everyone was equal and the poor and the destitute didn't have to suffer under the heels of the wealthy. For those of you keeping count at home, we have 3 Elysium visions now. There's Lovia's Hyperborea 2.0, Rotwang's Abyssal Elysium, and Avrelian's anti-capitalist paradise. Now, Avrelian may not have been aware of his heritage, but Rotwang, as I mentioned, certainly was. And all of Rotwang's subtle meddling in the background was just preparation for his grand plan, which involved manipulating Avrelian into helping him open the gateway to the Abyss. So now that Avrelian was all grown up and in Nod Krai, Rotwang made his first move. He orchestrated a meeting with Avrelian and revealed everything that he knew about his past. And in doing so, he convinced Avrelian that Lovia was his enemy and that his parents had died because of her actions. And Avrelian was swayed by Rotwang's words, especially once Rotwang started talking about building the Elysium that Avrelian dreamed of, because Rotwang could make that dream of Avrelian's come true. If only they could get their hands on Lovia's Sampo. After all, Avrelian was the chosen one, the only one who could use the Sampo to make this Elysium, and Rotwang could tell him how to do it. So one night, Avrelian snuck into the Frostmoon Scion Enclave to steal the Sampo, but it seems like he was caught by Alia, so he stole her too, I think. The details here are a little bit cloudy, but it seems as though Avrelian did successfully deliver the Sampo to Rotwang, but neither of them could use the device right away. Obviously, it was lacking a control module. So while Rotwang tried to develop another means to use the device, Avrelian took Alia back to his gang of treasure hoarders where the two became friends. But with Alia missing, Alia was forced to suffer Lovia's bloodline experiments alone, and she would then bear the responsibility of giving birth to the sacred heir. Because remember, Lovia still didn't know about Avrelian's existence, and even if she did, it's hard to know whether or not she would consider him to be the sacred heir since he was born to an outsider. Now, leaving Hisi Island and joining the treasure hoarders had opened Alia's eyes to the truth behind Lovia's intentions, and so she became suspicious of Rotwang's plans right away, and she didn't hesitate to share her thoughts with Avrelian. Now, how this next event came about is very unclear to me, but for one reason or another, Avrelian ended up making a trip to Snezhnaya to see the Belyet Tsar. Maybe Alia convinced him of Rotwang's bad intentions and he wanted to warn the Tsar, or maybe Rotwang fed him another lie and just wanted to be rid of him. Although I think Rotwang's involvement this time is a little unlikely because, as you'll see later on, Rotwang doesn't seem to have been aware that Avrelian was captured and executed in Snezhnograd, which is what happened. The first Reed Miller, Avrelian, died in Snezhnograd for real, and the event may or may not have been witnessed by both Alia and Solovey. Needless to say, Alia was devastated, but while she may not have been able to prevent his death, she could at least ensure that the name Reed Miller would live on in legend. So she donned a silver mask and Avrelian's identity and led the now militarized treasure hoarders in the heist of a lifetime, seizing every treasure from the Grand Duke's palace in a single night. The treasure hoarders then gave all of their treasure to the poor, telling them it was a gift from Reed Miller. And that's how the original legend of Reed Miller the Master Thief was born. Now, the Grand Duke's illegitimate or adopted son, Brahe, caught sight of Alia during the heist and instantly fell in love with her. As far as he was concerned, Alia hadn't just stolen his father's treasure, but his heart as well. Brahe was so smitten that he ran away from home and joined the treasure hoarders himself. Ironically, the book The Legends of Reed Miller, thief extraordinaire, was written about this encounter by Brahe, except he flipped all of the genders, which is what made deciphering this book initially very confusing, but we'll come back to him and his stories later. Now, it was around this time that Solovey and Alia crossed paths, likely because Solovey was very confused about how his friend, who he witnessed the execution of, had somehow returned from the dead. So Alia filled him in, and the two began investigating Rotwang in earnest. They soon discovered that his plans to create an Elysium using the Sampo were actually plans to bust open the sky and unleash the abyss onto that. And they couldn't stop him alone, so Solovey decided to seek help from Alia, since Alia could not afford to be caught by Lovia at the time. And Alia was understandably skeptical of him at first. After all, it seems as though she believed Reed Miller killed her sister. And now she has this stranger telling her that Alia is not only alive and well and in need of her assistance, but that she is the new Reed Miller. What a twist! Now, it didn't take long for Lovia to learn about Solovey, and she seems to have known about his investigations into both her and Rotwang's plans. So she tried to convince Alia that Solovey was a liar. Her sister obviously wasn't alive. In fact, Solovey may have been the one to murder sweet Alia. And for that, Solovey deserved to be killed at Alia's hands. And then Lovia would be rid of another problem. But Alia was more skeptical of Lovia than she was of Solovey. Or perhaps she just wanted to believe that Alia was alive. Either way, she decided to turn her blade against Lovia instead. And with Lovia's death, Alia became the new leader of the Frostmoon Scions. But even with Lovia gone, there was no clear path towards stopping Rotwang. In fact, he had already figured out how to activate the Sampo and was in the middle of doing it at the Pillar of Embla. Solovey and Alia rushed to the scene, but they were too late to stop him through any conventional means. But fortunately, Rotwang mistook the masked Alia for Avrelian, and he beckoned her closer so they could open the door to Elysium together. In a split-second decision that saved the world, Alia threw herself into the Sampo and forcibly ignited it with her own blood, killing Rotwang and herself in the process. Well, kind of. Killing is a little misleading of a word here. It turns out the Sampo has some space-time warping properties as well. Like during the transmutation process, space and time seem to get a little wonky. So Alia found herself wandering in that timeless space between life and death alongside Solovey's nightingale Eden, who did actually manage to escape and befriend Ilua 500 years later, which means technically Alia could do the same if she wanted to, somehow. So she's not really dead, she's just trapped in some interdimensional limbo. As for Rotwang, well, Rotwang had technically died, yes, but something about the Sampo eruption made it so that Rotwang would manage to resurrect himself a couple more times. According to Ila's prophecy, after Rotwang revived himself the first time, Solovey would need to subdue him first so that the Traveler could deliver the finishing blow in 500 years' time after Rotwang woke up again. So while the crisis had been averted for the time being, Solovey and Alia began preparations to subdue Rotwang because that was supposed to happen very, very soon. And by soon, I mean like imminently, because it was either just before this incident or right after this incident that the Khaenri'ahn Cataclysm hit Tevat. And with this abyssal flood came Rotwang's resurrection, and also Rerir's Wild Hunt invasion, but I'm gonna ignore him for now because he's not relevant. To seal Rotwang and force back the power of the Abyss, Alia entrusted Solovey with the Frostmoon Scion's second Hyperborean relic made by Voyager, the Arrow of Tepakaranis, and Solovey used it to great effect. With the help of the brave volunteers who would later become the very first Lightkeepers, he managed to chase Rotwang and his corrupted abyssal followers all the way back to Kipumaki Cliff, where he was sealed for the next 500 years. This didn't totally solve Nodkrai's abyssal problem, so Alia went to the Pillar of Embla at Solovey's request, and while the details are a little bit foggy here, based on Verna's dialogue, I believe that Alia used the silver lampwick to light the pillar, which then dispelled the encroaching darkness and put an end to the abyssal catastrophe for good. Thus marked the end of the Khaenri'ahn Cataclysm in Nodkrai. In the aftermath of the disaster, Alia decided to leave the Arrow of Tepakaranis in the hands of Solovey and the Lightkeepers so that they could continue to protect Nodkrai in the future. Alia, on the other hand, had received another prophecy, so she returned to Hisi Island to bear witness to it. Inside the Pillar of the Dragonborn was a small basin of primordial seawater, and above that basin was a sword forged by the creator of both the Arrow and the Sampo. And it was here that Alia foresaw a new moon goddess, Columbina Hyposelenia, being born. And with the birth of the new moon goddess, there would be no more need for the Sampo or a sacred heir. This Kutar would bless and guide the Frost Moon Scions just like her predecessor did, which means everything Lovia ever did was for nothing. After Columbina's birth, Alia sealed all the information about Lovia and the Sacred Heir project inside the Sanctum of the Oathkeeper, hoping to dissuade anyone from reviving those projects or pursuing the lost realm of Hyperborea. And she obviously didn't want anyone misusing the Sampo, so its whereabouts remain unknown. But this isn't quite the end of the Reed Miller story. Remember Brahe? Well, after the death of Alia, Brahe assumed the mantle of Reed Miller for himself. Not for any selfish reasons, but because the deaths of both the pure-intentioned Avrelian and his beloved Alia made Brahe question the ways society treated them. And he did not want their stories and legacy to be exploited by the wealthy and the elite. So he went out of his way to make that exploitation impossible by hiding the true stories of both Reed Millers under a pile of fiction. So first, he faked his own death, just like Avrelian did, and just like it appeared he did a second time when Alia popped up after he was executed. Then Brahe began writing countless stories about the mysterious Reed Miller as if it was one singular individual. Now, some of these stories were completely fabricated, and some of them were based in truth. But it didn't matter which was which, because if he did his job right, no one would ever be able to tell the difference. Eventually, Brahe's myth writing peaked with the invention of Reed Miller's great treasure. He even created a vault full of low-value treasure and iron coins, which may or may not be connected to those iron coins that we get during those treasure hunting Sealy events. And this vault could only be opened by passing Reed Miller's trial and obtaining all 5 proof of cognoscenti. But Brahe wasn't just a writer. He, like the other 2 Reed Millers before him, also had some impressive feats. See, Rotwang had quite a few followers in his prime, several of which believed Rotwang was going to use the Abyss to destroy Teyvat entirely, and he kind of was, so that belief was warranted. But one of his followers, Morozov, built a whole freaking doomsday bunker and filled it with people who believed they could use Kuvaki to purify the Abyss and rebuild the world after the apocalypse. But they all ended up becoming Morozov's test subjects instead, dying horrible deaths due to abyssal corruption. But one of the Kuvaki researchers there, Grazina, found out about Morozov's experimentation and somehow managed to get in contact with Reed Miller, who at the time was Brahe. And true to the Reed Miller legacy, Brahe helped the survivors of the bunker escape, and that included a lot of orphaned children. As for Morozov, well, all the abyssal experimentation had turned him into an abyssal something or other, and so he wandered the halls of the bunker for the next 500 years, earnestly believing that the world had already ended. And that, my friends, is the end and the beginning of the Reed Miller story. Now, normally this is the part where I share some final thoughts or some little fun facts or something, but I don't really have any this time around. Partly because I have written the full story of Reed Miller 3 times now. Once for a theory, which was obviously incomplete because it was done really early on. Then once 2 patches ago, and even though I had completely written, recorded, and finished editing that one, I never posted it because as I was getting ready to, we got live stream information, and then the live stream was saying, hey, there's more quests coming up in the new explorable Nod Krai region. I was like, dang. And I thought maybe I can just add corrections, but nope, I had to redo the whole thing. So here's attempt number 3. In any case, I hope this recap helped fill in the blanks for you if there was anything you were confused about, and if there's anything I missed, please don't hesitate to put it in the comments. I want to offer a big thank you to all of my channel members for supporting me and being very patient with these releases, and another offered thanks to you for watching. Take care of yourselves out there, happy questing, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye!